And it's time for round 2 of the debate. Who would win in an all-out fight between a knight, a Viking, and a samurai? In round 1, we played by MatPat's rules, where we only analyzed the warriors from the 11th century. But now we're going to play by Noggin's rules. We're going to look at these warriors at their absolute peak, when they had the best that they ever had. Their best armor, their best weapons, their best finances, their best health, their best of everything. When these warriors have all these things at their best, who is the winner? Well, let's dive in. Let's go ahead and point out right now that the Vikings haven't changed much since round 1. Honestly, the 11th century was the real pinnacle of the Viking Age. That was when they were at their best, and after that, the Vikings began to fade from the public eye. So there's little to say different about them now. The Knights, on the other hand, totally different story. By the High Gothic Age, knights could gain access to full plate mail armor, underlaying chainmail, and even gambeson. They would begin abandoning shields for the sake of two-handed, devastating polearms like halberds, poleaxes, longswords, maces, other heavy weapons. These were instruments that were used to bludgeon and break through armor. Now there's this idea nowadays that longswords are more blunt, bludgeoning, heavy weapons rather than sharp weapons, and this is ridiculous. Longswords were sharp. The thing is, plate mail was just so good at defense that quite often, no matter how sharp the sword was, it just wasn't going to cut through the armor very easily. So quite often, you just see these swords in pop culture movies just bang against armor and not do anything, and that's why people think, oh, it's not that sharp. Well, realize it's not going to cut through steel every time. Quite often, you'd have these bludgeoning weapons like the mace or the poleaxe or the hilt of the longsword doing more damage than the actual blade, but that doesn't mean that they weren't sharp. Also, as I just said, the armor was amazing. For this reason, the shields began to disappear. They weren't as commonly used. They were there, but you didn't need shields when your armor was that good. Now, Gnoggin did point out that they had maces. These weren't used for honor, that's going to come up later, but they did have maces. That was a weapon they had. The weapons the knights developed were definitely top tier in hand-to-hand combat, and their armor was second to none, some of the greatest battle armor forged in the medieval age. It was not clunky and heavy as pop culture likes to say, but actually rather maneuverable in most cases, and the weight was evenly distributed throughout the body to make for better movement and nimble movement. So, how does that compare to the samurai? Well, the very best armor the samurai had access to would probably be the Nanban Gusoku, or modern steel plate armor. When Europeans introduced firearms to Japan, the samurai quickly constructed armor to compensate. So the steel-plated version of this armor became more common. The armor was probably not as all-encompassing as the knight armor, but was still a solid defense against hacking and slashing weapons, and could probably even provide somewhat effective defense against basic arquebus firearms. In terms of hand-to-hand combat, the samurai still preferred distance weapons like their yari polearms, naginata, and kanabo clubs, and these weapons were designed to stab and strike from a distance, providing a safe area of defense around the warrior. And if push came to shove, though, the samurai did have their okatanas as a backup weapon, moving on from the tachi, which we talked about in the 11th century. And by the Edo period, which is considered by many to be the height of samurai power, the katana became more than just a battlefield weapon, but a status symbol for the samurai, because when you carry one, that marks you as a samurai. And the swords were often passed down through samurai households. The swords became legendary in their own right. Were they as good as the longsword? Debatable. It depends on what kind of longsword, what kind of katana, what kind of test you're doing. As a general rule, though, no, I think the longsword is the superior sword, but I don't want to discount it as people like Gnoggin did. Don't discount the katana just because to avoid samurai bias. We're not looking at this from a samurai or knight bias. We're looking at this from accuracy, and that's what I want to get started with. So, with all that said, with the basics out of the way, who has the edge? Both samurai and knights come into the fight with top-rate steel armor, though the knights is more all-encompassing. The samurai come with great distance weapons like the yari and naginata, and even a club to help bash in armor, but the knights also come to play with pole axes and long swords and maces. So who has the edge? Well, there is a single factor that changes this game entirely, a factor that both MatPat and Gnoggin exclude. Guns. And samurai had guns. Okay, and before you jump on me, I already see you in the comments section getting ready to harass me. Let me go ahead and address some of the things you're about to say.
But Raven for Honor doesn't have guns in it, so we can't count those.
And to that I say, Gnoggin made it clear he wanted to look at these warriors from a historically accurate perspective. If we're looking at the warriors at their best in history, then guns must be included. Besides, maces aren't in for honor either, and that didn't stop Gnoggin from including them. And no, the flail isn't a mace, two different kinds of weapons.
But Raven, guns are just a weapon the samurai happen to have access to. If the knights had them, they'd have just as much of an edge, if not more.
Okay, but that's kind of like saying, you wouldn't be so tough if you didn't have that gun. And my response to that is, yeah, but I do, don't I? It's a non-point.
But Raven, the samurai would see guns as dishonorable.
I made a whole video on the concept of honor to a samurai just so I could prepare for this video. And for the record, not only were guns used, some daimyo pioneered their use in battle. Oda Nobunaga perfected the use of a firing line for his warriors. And the Japanese began to mass produce their own firearms. Sure, there might have been some samurai who wouldn't want to use guns, but we're not talking about those specific samurai. We're looking at samurai and the general rule and what the best weapons samurai had access to would be. But here comes the big question, the question that's going to define this battle. Could the guns of the samurai puncture the armor of the knights? Well, here's something you might not know, and something that I think is very important. Firearms, at least early firearms, that were used at the time period of the knights, were not very effective against knight armor. The reason that plate mail armor and knightly armor started to fade from common use is not because it was weak, but because it was more expensive to manufacture. It's way cheaper to buy a bunch of guns and arm a handful of soldiers with them than to outfit that same number of soldiers with plate mail armor. Guns were easier to make, cheaper to make, and thus easier to produce. If you make a set of armor, it needs to fit the person that's wearing it correctly, and it needs to be forged and made after a long period of time. Guns don't require that same amount of detail and work. Guns are much easier and cheaper to produce. It's more cost effective. And that didn't mean that knight armor couldn't hold up against it. Far from it. Knight armor was actually really good in most cases against early firearms that were around at the time period of knight armor. So would the samurai guns be of any use in this case? Well, probably not the early stuff. Early arquebuses and matchlock rifles would be of very little use to the knight. It would be of very little use to the samurai against knight armor. Tanegashima rifles were decent, but lacked the stopping power to go through steel plate armor. There's always the chance for a lucky hit. Sure, if the bullet hit a weak spot in the armor, it could potentially do damage. But that's a big if, and I sure wouldn't want to decide this battle based on an if. So the knights win, right? If the guns are no match for their armor, then the knights still take it in the end, right? And that would be the case if we only look at the early firearms of the samurai. We're forgetting an important period of Japanese history here. The samurai did not fade from history until 1877 after the Battle of Shiroyama. In the period known as the Bakumatsu, near the end of the Tokugawa shogunate, the imperial family was attempting to reclaim the country from the Tokugawa shogun and the samurai. Britain and America offered their support to the imperial army by providing guns and uniforms for the Japanese imperial army. One of the first things the samurai acquired to fight back? Firearms of the age. They did raid an armory to get guns. They did acquire firearms to fight back. And the firearms of that era would be Civil War era firearms. We're talking rifles far superior to the early guns of Nobunaga and the Portuguese. We're talking about percussion-capped rifles, which are like flintlocks but can be fired in the rain. Their superior rifling allowed for stronger force in the firearms and lethality, and Mine ball ammunition was superior to flintlock and early matchlock rifle ammunition. These guns could cut through the steel armor that the knights wear like it was paper. They're more accurate, easier to reload, and with unbelievable stopping power. This grants an outstanding edge to the samurai. The gun advantage alone gives them a solid advantage over the knights. Now, some might point out that guns did exist in the days of the knights too. Couldn't we grant guns to the knights? I mean, We could, but knights rarely used guns, even when they became available. By the time that guns were introduced, knights were rarely used in battle anymore and were more regulated to tournaments and ceremonial purposes. But even when used in battle, guns were given to common foot soldiers, while knights were used as cavalry warriors on horseback as shock troopers. Most knights wouldn't have access to guns. But even if we did give the knights guns, these early firearms that they had would be on par with what the samurai had been given from Portugal during the days of Nobunaga, and their armor, the Nanban Gusoku, was developed specifically to help counter that. It isn't as big an advantage as you might expect. Sure, it could be somewhat effective, but again, it's all a game of if at that point. Whereas we have 1877 level rifles given by the West to the samurai, and that gun would definitely be effective against knight armor. Now, of course, if we remove the guns as a factor in this battle, then yes, I do think the knights have a solid, encompassing lead. They have the better armor, in my opinion, which gives them an edge over the samurai, and I do think they have the superior heavy weapons. The katana, as a rule, is not as devastating as a longsword, and while the yari and poleaxe are both comparable in length, the poleaxe is a versatile weapon for slashing and stabbing, while the yari is mostly just stabbing. Even the naginata, which can do both actions as well, lacks the weight advantage of the massive polearms of the knights. However, because we're looking at these soldiers at their absolute best, with their best gear and weapons available from a historical vantage point, the samurai's guns that they had access to in the Bakumatsu give them a distinct edge over the knights and Vikings, who unfortunately did not progress their warrior culture after the 11th century, as I said before. And okay, I know some of you will argue that because the samurai didn't always have access to these guns, and they were technically Western-made products, we shouldn't count it. Well, two problems with that. Firstly, how far do we want to take that rabbit hole? I mean, if that's the direction we want to go, then technically the Vikings shouldn't have their Ulfbert swords, because most of them got their steel for those swords and the materials for them from Persia. We shouldn't give any black powder weapons to the knights because they took that from the Indians and Persians. We can't give the knights any of their tactics they learned during the Crusades because they might have learned those from the Arabs. Warfare is all about appropriating technology and tactics. You grow and change as you learn from battle and from other cultures. So, yeah. And secondly, let's pretend the Bakumatsu didn't happen and Japan was faced with a threat from China or something. Don't you think the government would want to arm their samurai with the best weapons at their disposal? At that point in time, there was open trade between America and the West at that time. They probably would have been able to get access to these guns at that point anyway. In this case, early firearms, those level of firearms. There are always factors to include, and some of them, some people may not want to acknowledge. So, for this fight, and again, I never say which one is the definitive winner because there are so many factors to go into a fight that we can't always account for. There are no guarantees in real warfare, but I will say who gets the edge, and when looking at them from their absolute best with their absolute best weapons and arms, in this case, I have to give the edge to the samurai. If only for the reason that they have the more modern firearm to bring to bear against the Vikings, who really didn't evolve much after the 11th century, and against the knights, who have superior armor and hand-to-hand weapons, but just don't have anything that can stand up to that level of firearm. And yes, I acknowledge if we leave firearms out of the game, knights do have an edge, but we have to include everything that all warriors have. So, thank you for tuning in for this round 2 of the question of who would win. Next time in round 3, we'll be looking at the world of For Honor and only giving the warriors their in-game weapons and armor, and we'll discuss not only who would win in the game canon scenario, but also who would actually win the faction war. Yes, I'm actually merging my idea for the 4th video with my 3rd video. We're going to take a look at the full faction war, looking at environment, tactics, technology, and other factors that decide if the faction war were a real thing. And we actually took the canon lore of For Honor and took the canon characters and their armor and weapons, who would actually win based on an army versus army scenario. Stay tuned for the 3rd and final round of who would win, the Knights, the Vikings, or the Samurai. See you then, guys.